Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. It's an important day in Iran as that country heads to the polls to vote in presidential elections, which are currently taking place as of this recording as well. Polling may very well be able to be extended till around midnight Tehran time, or Iran time, I should say, in fact, although it is, purportedly to end around 5 p.m., depending, of course, upon if the lines end by then or not. There are concerns about low turnout. There are also concerns about the disqualifications that took place on the part of the Guardian Council. Is this essentially an activity or a process that is meant to guarantee Ibrahim Raisi coming into office as the president? He is the judiciary chief currently, although he also does have other opponents as well, such as Nasser Himmati, Ghazizadeh Hashemi, and Mohsen Rezai, who are still very much in this race as well. Let's discuss all of the above a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Setareh, Sadiqi, who is a political analyst. She's a PhD in American Studies from the University of Tehran. She's joining us today from Isfahan. Joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Neda Bolourchi, who is a postdoctoral assistant professor at Rutgers University. Neda and Setareh, thank you both for taking our time out to join us today. Neda, let me start with you. As I said, there are a number of concerns on the part of the international community about the process that took place to get us to this day. What are your thoughts about that process and about democracy in Iran today?
Well, on the one hand, I think that sort of the international outcry about Iran's electoral process is a little hyperbolic and a bit hypocritical, to be honest. Most other governments are not particularly concerned about how other countries in the region are not having elections. That having been said, this is an election for concern inside of Iran because while elections have not been necessarily free and fair historically in Iran, the way that the Guardian Council has eliminated so many potential candidates, former presidents, current vice presidents, is very much a clear concern to those advocates of democracy and electoral reform.
Setareh, what are your thoughts as somebody in Iran? What do you make of A, the disqualification, and B, the campaigns that have been run? I mean, do you feel that all of this has been, as some have said early on in the process, more of a selection than an election?
Well, it's definitely something that a lot of people are very disappointed about, no matter what political party or political inclinations they come from. Both reformists and principalists have objected the way the Guardian Council has been vetting the candidates and has disqualified a lot of the candidates who currently hold positions in other parts of the Iranian establishment. But at the same time, you see that people are still trying to hold on to the ballot boxes to voice their opposition and play a role in determining what kind of an administration is going to come to office again. And they don't want to lose that hope of being part of this decisions making system.
Then what does this, do you think, mean then for the foreign policy front when it comes to, for example, I mean, if we're to presume Raisi does win, do you think that creates this huge difference in how, for example, the Vienna talks will play out? Or does this not really make a difference? Because, I mean, it's not like the nuclear talks just happened under Rouhani, right? I mean, they'd been happening even under the Ahmadinejad years.
Precisely. Well, the nuclear talks will go on. This is foreign policy is not dictated by the existing president. It's something that comes from the Supreme Leader's office. And you even see with Foreign Minister Zarif, he reported to and had talks with Khamenei himself. And so this is not a policy that is really within the president's office. How it's presented is definitely within the president's office. Who is leading those negotiations are very important in terms of their reputation and relationship with the international community, the sort of the trust that might be there with other participants of the international community. And so that's why we can increasingly, if Raisi wins, look to Araghchi, possibly Larijani for the foreign ministry. And so you're not going to see a substantial shift. And you already have the candidates who've said that. Particularly Raisi himself has confirmed that the JCPOA negotiations will go forward. And I wouldn't expect to see an administration under Raisi make sort of belligerent or negative comments. In fact, what I would expect to see is that a bit of a speed up, if you will, in negotiations and possibly an end to negotiations in the coming months, where the next president will, of course, take credit for the positive elements of the newly negotiated deal and blame the negatives, of course, on the Rouhani administration.
Right. Do you agree with that? Do you think that there will be little difference when it comes to the foreign policy, and especially, of course, most importantly, the Vienna talks and the nuclear deal and how that may pan out? Because as you well know, Setareh, and as I'm sure Neda knows well as well, that the narrative has always been that a hardliner, quote unquote, will come into office in Iran, and that will make it that much harder then to deal with Iran.
Yeah, as you and Neda correctly pointed, these negotiations have been taking place for years, even before Foreign Minister Zarif and President Rouhani came into office. And the presidential debates, the televised debates, as well as the candidates' promises show that they're not going to adopt a very different approach towards the deal. And everyone acknowledges that it has been worked very hard, and it has been achieved after years of negotiations. What may kind of be different is that if Raisi wins, since the current members of the parliament are more principlist than reformist or the moderates, he will have more support from the parliament. And as you know, the members of the parliament had previously objected parts of the deal and criticized Zarif, and made it a little bit difficult for him to work on the deal with the European signatories as well as the U.S. So the only thing that we might be able to see is that we will see less opposition coming from the parliament. And as the candidates have already said, they're not going to adopt a very different approach towards the deal, and they're going to work on reviving the JCPOA.
Neda, obviously Rouhani's had to have the the bad luck of having these major sanctions, this maximum pressure campaign enacted by Donald Trump happened during his tenure. What do you make of then the economic situation, as well as, there's a lot of talk about mismanagement, corruption within Iran as well, right? Do you think that it will then be, for example, a conservative like Raisi who will possibly be able to come in and fix that as well? Because as much as there's talk of, yes, sanctions affecting the Iranian economy, there's also just equal amount of talk about mismanagement and corruption as well.
Well, I think that actually results from more the system, the dual system that runs in Iran, where you're not exactly sure who is doing what, and money, there's not what we would necessarily call the most professional accounting of money. And so as a result of a dual system, basically two governments that run side by side, where one has supremacy over the other, and sort of a lack of accounting measures, then you have mismanagement, right? And so before we even get to the sanctions, Iran could and did largely do fine. But with these immense sanctions put on Iran, that just compounds infinitely the problems with mismanagement. And so that isn't necessarily, again, something that the president's office can fix. They can do subsidies, they can do direct payments that Ahmadinejad did during his presidency. Rezai is talking about direct payments for those who work at home and has garnered support amongst housewives. And so there are other ways that you can go about it, but the nature of the mismanagement seems to be something a little bit above and beyond what's possible within the president's office. Hemmati, as somebody who, as a technocrat, has really tried to work and pace part of sort of the measured success of the Rouhani administration, and I say that very give me a little leeway to explain that, is the fact that they tried very much to keep the Iranian populace from getting too upset or to expect too much from negotiations. And so they were able to, believe it or not, tamp down some of the rampant inflation, despite the fact that Iran has been dealing with 40% inflation, massive unemployment, a currency that is spiraling. They were actually, in the grand scheme of things, relatively successful with the situation they were facing.
All right, so I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. On that issue of corruption, I wanted to get your thoughts, A, and mismanagement, and secondly, something that Neda pointed to, and that is the dual realities in Iran. And, there's a lot of talk about, and a lot of misunderstanding, in fact, if I put it this way, about the Iranian governing system and how it really functions. And it does seem a lot more complex than a lot of us may appreciate.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the Iranian political system has always been portrayed as just, a hardliner versus moderate political parties, whereas it's a very complicated system with a lot of political bodies working together. Sometimes there is a conflict of interest, and that's what causes or allows for corruption or a centralization of power. I think what is important about the difference that we are at this round of elections are seeing compared to when President Rouhani was elected into office is that the people no longer buy the slogan that the JCPOA or a nuclear deal would solve all the economic problems. Perhaps a major failure or a major promise that was failed to be met by Rouhani's government was that all the economic promises, or a major part of the economic promises, were laid on the JCPOA. And now Mr. Hemmati, who has been appointed to as the head of the Central Bank of Iran and worked closely with Mr. Rouhani, knows that very well. And this is one thing that he even pointed in his campaigns, that saying that Mr. Rouhani didn't really know economy, and that's something that we have to be very careful about, that we should rely more on domestic capabilities. And there is also a public opinion poll by the University of Maryland, which was adopted on Iranians a few months ago, I think around February, if I'm not mistaken, which shows that now Iranians see their roots of their economic problems coming from economic mismanagement by the politicians, rather than a failure of reviving the JCPOA.
We'll have to leave it there at that, but we really, really appreciate both Setareh and Neda for taking their time out and for contextualizing, the voting that we're seeing today, where we stand today when it comes to democracy in Iran, as well as the governing system, and what this means both for domestic policy, such as corruption, mismanagement, etc., which are key issues, of course, alongside other issues, and for the international community, then Vienna talks and a whole host of such other issues. We weren't able to talk about regional issues, but those are also extremely important. We will keep a very close eye on how those elections pan out. The word is that we'll have the results by noon tomorrow. That is on Saturday. We'll wait and see if that does happen and who exactly then becomes the winner and what that means then for Iran going forward. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, not too long ago, we did discuss this apparent coup plot in Jordan. And it was discussed at that time the Prince Hamza, who is the half-brother of the current King Abdullah. He had been essentially placed under house arrest, if I may use that term, because of his possible involvement in a coup plot against his own brother. New details have come out about what may have in fact been happening behind the scenes, and it seems that all of this, the root cause of it was in the deal of the century that had been presented by Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law. The deal of the century, of course, having to do with Israel-Palestine and a resolution to that issue, and the fact that King Abdullah was hesitant, and I believe is still very much hesitant to accepting any such Middle East peace plan as had been constructed by Donald Trump. What does this then say, about Jordan's shifting policies, if that is what's happened here vis-a-vis Israel, and or just the fact that the United States would think, and Israel would think, that it was smart to even try to overthrow the sitting monarch of Jordan just because he chose not to sign on to the deal of the century? Let's discuss a bit of that further. We're now joined by Dr. Hasan Almomani, who is a professor of international relations and conflict management at Prince Al-Husain bin Abdullah II School of International Studies at the University of Jordan. He is joining us today from Amman. Joining us today from London is Dr. Nicolai Due-Gundersen, who is a lecturer of post-conflict studies at the United Nations University. We're now joined by, thank you both for joining us, Nicolai and Hasan, pardon me. We appreciate your time. Nicolai, let me start with you, if I may, first. What do you make of the details that have come out? Was the deal of the century that sensitive a point that Donald Trump and Netanyahu would actually want to overthrow Abdullah? I mean, that seems like quite an extreme measure, doesn't it?
I agree, that is quite an extreme measure. And we have to recall there are several factors in play, and each actor involved had their own reasons to get on board. What I suspect in this instance is not that Trump and Netanyahu wanted to necessarily overthrow Abdullah, because Jordan is a point of stability for the Middle East. However, they have been pressuring King Abdullah. Let's remember that before this supposed coup attempt, Netanyahu and Abdullah were butting heads over several issues, including access, for example, to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, access to water resources. And it's possible that in this instance, what they did was instead they said, we can overthrow you if we want. We're not necessarily going to do it, but we can go that far if we want. And someone like Prince Hamza, who wants to be king, who was groomed by his mother to be king, is someone who would have considered getting on board with any plot that could have led to him becoming king. This is an individual who has been networking with Jordan's tribes on and off for quite a while now, way before the supposed coup attempt, before the deal of the century. And so we have several actors coming together, and I do believe personally that it was an attempt to pressure Abdullah even further to say, look, get on board with the deal. If you don't, there are things we could do. I don't necessarily feel that Trump and Netanyahu would have fully supported Hamza, but they wanted to show that the possibility existed that they could, and they could therefore push Abdullah to get on board with the deal.
Hasan, what are your thoughts on that? Because this I imagine that enters sensitive territory for Jordan, right? Where you have Queen Noor and Prince Hamza involved in this sort of thing. I mean, would they want to side with the deal of the century, or was this more just about internal family dynamics?
I think the issue of Hamza and the dissatisfaction actually goes back to the time when Hamza was relieved, actually, as a crown prince by King Abdullah in that sense. And since then, in a number of occasions, Hamza expressed his dissatisfaction from this decision. However, when it comes to deal of the century and pressure has been, Jordan has always, experienced pressure in terms of Palestinian question. And Palestinian question has always generated challenges to Jordan in that respect. And I think, during the Trump era, it was clear that Jordan, under no circumstances, had the ability to join Trump efforts in terms of deal of the century, simply and from a pragmatic and rational point of view. There is a widely acknowledged conviction in Jordan that you can't overcome and overpass the Palestinians. I mean, if you want to overcome the Palestinians and overpass the Palestinians and speak on their behalf, I think that would be a sort of a suicidal death. So even even if it wasn't King Abdullah, from my perspective, it would be so much difficult for any king to overcome the Palestinians in that respect. So the issue of Hamza could have been used, took advantage from the part of Israelis and certain figures in the Trump administration, so to pressure King Abdullah, because in the context of their efforts to implement such a plan, they were trying to rally support, and of course Jordan as I would say an important party to peace process apart from the Palestinians and Israelis. So I think Jordan could have been, under pressure in that respect. And mind you, Hamza issue be revealed at the time of a new administration in this respect, which of course this new administration, I would not rule out the fact that this administration was part of this revolution, because it is in the interest of this administration to show the shortcomings and misconducts of the previous administration when it comes to the region and when it comes to Jordan in that respect. But let me clarify something.
Sure.
Officially, Jordan officially never spoke of this attempt as a coup attempt.
Yeah,
it is sort of a sedition, which is short of that respect. And from my perspective, I would consider it as a sort of an attempt from part of Jordan to preempt, to prevent further development of such a planning or plotting that could be critical for Jordan's security.
Okay, Nicolai, if I may for a moment just bring this up, it's not like Jordan has been anti-Israel, right? I mean, it's worked with Israel when it comes to issues surrounding Jerusalem or the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the compound, etc. I mean, there have been times where there have been tensions between the two sides, but I mean, Jordan would not be seen as one of those countries in the Arab or in the Islamic world which has had major difficulties with Israel. So why pick on somebody who is essentially, for lack of a better word, an ally?
But I think also we need to put a wider context into this. So when it comes to Jordan's relationship with Israel, there is a peace treaty, but Jordan has a large Palestinian populace. So King Abdullah, and indeed any monarch, must be very, very careful with how they tread that line. Going back to your question of why would they pick on an ally, or would Trump, for example, do that? Abdullah was one of the first kings to visit the White House when Trump came into power, but it's no secret that the two haven't necessarily gotten on. Trump was at the White House. There was an emphasis on, what is my legacy? What can I do? The deal of the century would have been his, and perhaps to a point, Jared Kushner's legacy as well. And I think that there was a lot of ego coming into play, pushing Trump into trying to convince Abdullah, or even stronger Abdullah, into accepting this deal. And I know that Abdullah himself would not do that because, as he probably said, this is crossing a red line, and he has to be very careful with how he deals with his internal politics, his domestic politics. Let's not forget that right now, in addition to having had protests where Palestinians who have Jordanian citizenship have said, this is our land, this is our right, we now have the coronavirus, and it has hit Jordan hard. Jordan has always been a country that has been, sadly, resource dry, but now with COVID, there's increasing unemployment, and so we see a lot of timing feeding into this. For example, Prince Hamza himself may have felt that at a time when there is much unemployment and people are becoming more desperate, now is a good time as well to return to networking with the tribes and also to focus on his narrative of being, in a sense, the true successor to King Husain.
I'll give you the final word then before I let both of you go. Where do we go from here then, vis-a-vis Jordan's relations with Israel, more importantly, and even the United States? I mean, obviously we have a new administration in office, so that's different. And even in Israel, we have a new government in office. But as we know with the Israelis, the establishment's foreign policies, I would imagine, largely will remain the same. Does this mean that there will be tensions then for the foreseeable future between the Jordanians and the Israelis?
ups and downs has been the order of the relation between Jordan and Israel, particularly when it comes to dealing with Netanyahu in that respect. And let me say something here. What has been revealed suggests that even Israel was divided over the issue of Hamza, where Netanyahu being accused of collaborating while security and other institutions, they disassociated themselves from what Netanyahu did in that respect. So I would say at the strategic level, Jordan is still fully committed with peace with Israel, and it is subject to developments within Israeli domestic politics. I mean, of course, Jordan has a problem with the Israeli right. But if, in those coming months, if there would be a change in Israeli domestic politics in favor of peace and in favor of pacifying relation with Jordan, then that would be good for Jordan. When it comes to the United States, I think Jordan, is a strategic partner with the United States. And it seems so far, I think Jordan and Biden administration so far are doing good and great. And, within the coming weeks, probably we would expect King Abdullah to go there and meet with Biden. And since Biden was elected, actually he presented and his administration offered a number of steps and gradually become involved in the region and reversed back the traditional American position of two-state solution, which goes in line with the Jordanian position. So I think for Jordan, probably now is much relieved than before during the Trump administration. And I would assume both Jordan and the United States, along with the concerned parties, would invest much effort so to resume talks. For Israel, still, Israel is still suffering from this sort of turbulent politics. I mean, in that respect. So the issue of ups and downs in the Israeli domestic politics would continue to overshadow the Jordanian-Israeli relations. But at the strategic level, Jordan and Israel both are committed to their peace agreement.
Very well. Leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Hasan and Nicolai for speaking to us from Amman and London, respectively. Hasan is with the University of Jordan, and Nicolai is with the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, known by its abbreviation UNITAR. We were discussing there the details that have come out vis-a-vis, as Hasan there said, it's not been labeled, in fact, a coup attempt. It's just being spoken of in more general terms. But I mean, if I may use the term coup attempt, because that does seem to be the way it was headed, at least the intentions of the United States, or specifically under Donald Trump and Israel, specifically under Netanyahu, had towards King Abdullah, because he did not want to sign on to the deal of the century as it was presented by Kushner, something that I mentioned in introduction. Will things change now? Where do things stand right now, both internally in Jordan, because we know Queen Noor and Prince Hamza essentially were on the same side when it came to this issue. How involved were they really in all of this? And what does this then mean for family dynamics within the monarchy? And secondly, then, of course, vis-a-vis Jordan's relations then with the United States and even the new Israeli establishment. We'll keep a very close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to continue to discuss Islamophobia in Canada. Now, ever since that horrendous terror attack that took place in London, Ontario, there have been a number of other incidences, both before and after, in fact, that terror attack, which also then, go to symbolize the amount of hate that is in certain people's hearts. Of course, in Canada, we've had this bomb threat seemingly against a Toronto mosque, one that I've seen a number of times while I've been on the ground there in Toronto, the Islamic Institute of Toronto. It's a fairly large mosque that is well known in the neighborhood that it sits in. It was threatened apparently by a bomb by a man and a woman who were also, according to police at least, on drugs at the time. And then on top of that, we've had a number of attacks against Muslim women in hijab in the city of Edmonton as well in Canada. And that's also troubling because that's been happening, in fact, for a while now. So this latest incident that we can talk about is not the first such incident in Edmonton, but in fact it's happened a number of times, especially on public transport in that city. We've also had other mosques and institutions being targeted by vandalism and otherwise in Edmonton as well, I believe. So let's discuss that a bit further and what this then symbolizes at this point in time. We're joined now by Adnan Husain, who is the director of the School of Religion and Muslim Societies, the Global Perspectives Project at Queen's University. He's joining us this morning from Kingston, Ontario, and joining us from Toronto, Ontario is Faisal Kutty, who is a lawyer, law professor professor, writer, public speaker, and human rights activist. Faisal and Adnan, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Adnan, I'd like to start with you, if I may. You know, there's this threat against the Toronto Mosque, these attacks on the Muslim women in hijab. What does this all symbolize in your mind about where we're heading, even in a multicultural society which prides itself, mind you, on multiculturalism, such as Canada?
Yes, well, thank you for covering this very important topic and the phenomenon of Islamophobia in Canada. Despite the image of Canada being a very tolerant and multicultural country, there are persistent problems of Islamophobia that I have to say are not exceptional and isolated in their manifestation. The act of violence that I'm sure you covered, the killing of the 4 members of the Faisal family for being visibly Muslim on the streets of London, Ontario, is of course not only a tragic and horrifying episode of extreme violence that gets our attention, but it is just the tip really of the iceberg of a social problem that's really quite widespread in Canadian society. And I have to say is also something of a product of state policy and the policies of the Canadian state over the last decade or so, using the war on terrorism approach to construct Muslims as a kind of security threat, put them under surveillance, and to create a culture of fear that we then see manifesting in harassment of Muslim women, as well as those violent sorts of attacks.
Faisal, I want to get your thoughts on that, but I wanted to add this on. You know, interestingly, we've seen, Faisal, as I'm sure you're well aware of and you've observed, a lot of politicians who in the past have been, I wouldn't say completely directly Islamophobic, each one of them, but, you know, just borderline in that regard, have started walking back some of their past statements. So I'm talking about specifically some of those who served under the likes of Stephen Harper. We've even had Kenny, and, you know, he's also walked back parts of his statements or denied, in fact, that he supported a niqab ban as well. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, is then the tide changing politically as well when it comes to awareness about this issue?
I'm not quite sure that it's changing right now. This horrendous incident happened, and of course, there's a public relations angle to this. So I think some of it is just lip service. But I'll wait to make that final assessment. But as Mr. Adnan said, Dr. Adnan said, this perception that Canada is void of these things is completely false. That narrative needs to be challenged. I mean, there's statistics, studies have been done where they show that almost 47% of Canadians have a negative perception of Islam. 47% are against the hijab. 52% believe that Muslims cannot be trusted. And these figures can be contrasted to Europe, for instance, where 37% have a negative perception and 30% in the US. So I don't want to paint the image that Canadians are racist, and there's a fringe group that actually pushes this agenda. And unfortunately, as Dr. Adnan said, the government policy, starting with the whole anti-terror, war on terror, which has been used to really go after Muslims, is leaving the impression in the minds of many that Muslims cannot be trusted. And that's the crux of what we're seeing. And as you said about the walking back, Aaron O'Toole, who's the leader of the Conservative Party, was one of those who opposed an Islamophobia motion, which was introduced in 2016 by MP Waqar Rizvi. It was just a motion to study Islamophobia, a symbolic, motion. It wasn't a bill, it wasn't a law, but the way it was opposed. And then subsequent to that, in 2018, a report was released. And when that report was released, they made 30 recommendations. And only one of those recommendations was actually fulfilled by the government. And that was to declare a day of remembrance for the shooting in Quebec. That was it. The rest have not been implemented. At the same time, the Conservatives came out with a dissenting report. And they basically said there's really no problem with Islamophobia. And also, there's 26 definitions of Islamophobia, so we should not be using it. That was their conclusion. And I hope we're going to see that that's going to change. And we're looking out to see that they follow through with some changes.
What are your thoughts about the politics of all this, right? As Faisal there said, yes, Aaron O'Toole, who's the Conservative leader right now, he also did, make what many would call, in fact, quite a good statement at some points, especially in some of his tweets after the London terror attack. Is the tide changing? Where do you assess things are when it comes to the politics, and will this actually make a difference on the ground, or is this just lip service for the sake of it right now?
Well, unfortunately, I think that a lot of it can be put down to symbolic gestures in the aftermath of a very obvious, extreme, and undeniable vicious act of Islamophobia. So it's in that context that most of these sorts of statements that are being made by the kinds of politicians you mentioned are designed really to characterize this as exceptional. It's just a few particular individuals, and to ignore the broader social conditions of Islamophobia and negative attitudes in racial and religious terms of bigotry and prejudice against them are widespread in society, and above all, their own complicity in fueling aspects of Islamophobia through laws that have been used and exploited politically, in the last decade, and very successfully, like, for example, the, barbaric zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices act that really just targeted aspects of what were perceived as immigrant Muslim culture and life. So, there is a lot of double talk that's happening, and unless they really address and acknowledge that Islamophobia is a broader phenomenon that has structural roots within Canadian government and state policy, I would be a little cautious before suggesting that the tide really has turned. And I think one of the troubling aspects of these most recent incidents is that Islamophobia seems to be, despite all of these statements, perhaps on the rise in various ways. And this happened also in 2017 after the Quebec City mosque massacre, that actually acts of harassment or hate-filled responses targeting Muslims and against Islam actually rose 50%. During that year subsequent to the attack that happened in late January that killed 6 and wounded 19 at the mosque. So I think that's something that we have to be a little concerned about. What measures are they actually going to put in place to educate against Islamophobia, to root it out as a systemic problem rather than just characterizing it as a phenomenon of a very few fringe groups that manifest in occasional extreme acts of violence.
Faisal, at the same time that we're seeing these sort of fringe groups and this increase of Islamophobia, we also have Mahmoud Jamal, who's been nominated by Trudeau. He's an Ontario judge to serve on the Supreme Court, and that's been seen as huge progress, certainly in representation. Is that going to then help in that regard?
Having minorities come to the forefront and be appointed is a great sign. But I think the most important thing is for politicians and people in prominence to speak out and not to support Islamophobia. For instance, yesterday, a columnist for the Toronto Sun, Tariq Fatah, wrote an article a couple of days ago titled, "There is no Islamophobia in Canada," within days of the burial of 4 people who were killed by an Islamophobe. He writes an article, and one of the passages in the article is that Muslims are asked to say 48 times, to condemn Christians and Jews 48 times a day in our prayers. Completely false. This is published in a newspaper, Toronto Sun, which people will dismiss and say, well, that's just a rag, and Tariq Fatah is just an anti-Muslim hater. But the reality is they have followers. Reality is they have hundreds of thousands of readers. And so those are the readers who will vote. Those are the readers who will act. Those are some of those readers who will carry out Islamophobic attacks. And to make it even worse, that Tariq Fatah then tweets this article out, and it's retweeted by none other than Irvin Cotler, who was a former Justice Minister of Canada, former Attorney General of Canada. So when you have somebody like that amplifying that message, and of course, Irvin Cotler, when he got caught, he apologized. He said it was an accidental tweet. I don't know how you accidentally tweet something like that and then correct it later. So when you have people like this promoting this, any positive image you have is being contrasted with all of the negativity, which far outweighs any kind of positive image of Islam. And then when you have individuals in power positions, respected people, sending this message out, we have a lot of work to do.
Adnan, we're quickly running out, so I just want to give you the final word. We have about a minute left. I want to get your final thoughts about where we head now, right? So what needs to happen now? I know the NCCM has made a number of demands, and there's also talk about a National Day of Islamophobia. Or is that the route to go?
That's one route to go because it's necessary for public memory and public education to insist that Islamophobia exists and to acknowledge and try to address it. But I think going beyond that, we need to work against that surveillance and security apparatus that has really exclusively targeted Muslims. And secondly, really focus on education and the history of racism and colonialism in Canada more broadly to change the culture and our sense of ourselves as a nation. And finally, I would say for Muslims, we need to insist on solidarity with other groups that are struggling against injustice and racism, and that is especially Black and Indigenous struggles for justice and equality in our society, that trying to find solutions for Islamophobia alone, separately from the broader cause of justice, I don't think will transform society to make it an inclusive and equal society for all.
We'll leave there at that, but we really appreciate both Adnan and Faisal for taking their time out this morning to share their insights with us. We were discussing there the threat against Toronto Mosque, the Islamic Institute of Toronto, as well as attacks on Muslim women in hijab in the city of Edmonton, and a whole host of other Islamophobic attacks, especially keeping in mind the London terror attack, which took place not too long ago in Ontario. What does this mean, especially also taking into account then politicians' rhetoric in the past and now them walking back, a lot of them at least walking back their respective viewpoints that were expressed in the past, and now saying that, hey, they don't stand for Islamophobia, that they deny even asking for niqab bans, which they are on record as having done so, demanding so. In fact, not too long ago, back in 2015, Jason Kenney had done so. So what does this mean then going forward? Will there be real change on the ground? That's the real question, as we've discussed with Faisal and Adnan in this conversation. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.